Can we see?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so I think I'll get started. Would that be fine, Jeannie? Hello? Oh,
Yes, go ahead. I'm just going to let the recording roll and then I'll break it up in editing later.
okay, sounds good. All right, so what I'm going to be talking with you all about today is I and others have done a lot of work related to messaging and communication, targeting transient boaters and anglers, but an audience that has not been studied as much is how do lakeshore property owners think about aquatic invasive species management strategies. So we'll be sharing the results with you of a exciting survey, and then ending the presentation with recommendations and some questions that might generate some discussion from the group here today. If you could advance, Richard. Okay, in terms of an introduction to the study, even though lakeshore property owners are clearly a key stakeholder group, they have not been studied that much in the academic literature. In fact, I haven't seen that much. I'm not saying that there's nothing, but relatively speaking, it's understudied relative to a prevention context. But what's really interesting about that is when aquatic invasive species come to a new lake, the transient boaters and anglers can leave and go back to wherever they came from, but the lakeshore property owners are often left dealing with the consequences of AS that come into the lake via other stakeholder groups. So it's important to understand how lakeshore property owners view AIS, how they see the risk and benefits for various management strategies. And something else that I just wanted to bring up briefly is the idea for this grant started several years ago at the annual Lakes Convention, where I was going around and asking people from the DNR and Extension and AIS coordinators and different folks, what is one unintended consequence of our success in prevention messaging? Because research shows that people in Wisconsin are relatively aware about how to prevent AIS. And the only response I got, and I got it several times over and over again, is that one unintended consequence of succeeding in prevention messaging may be using fear appeals or appeals that might frighten lakeshore property owners, which then would increase lakeshore property owners' negative reactions to aquatic invasive species. So we'll get into that in just a few moments. Some of that was bore out in our analysis. Richard, if you could go to the next one, I want to show both. So there's different types of messaging, and Wisconsin doesn't use all of these, but I've used some of them. I think we've certainly all seen things that you use militaristic metaphors, concepts like invasions, invasive species, the very terminology that we're fighting a war against invasive species. And generally speaking, this appeals to fear. And fear can be helpful in certain persuasive contexts, but only to the extent that people feel a corresponding sense of self-efficacy or confidence or collective efficacy to deal with that threat. And so these are commonly used ways to describe invasive species. Next slide, please. So one other type of messaging that we regularly see also has some ethical considerations, and that's ones that we might consider nativist, or with a less positive spin, even xenophobic. And that the basic idea here is that invasive plants don't belong and therefore must be removed. So there's xenophobic connotations to these. And some of the rhetoric you might notice isn't that different than some of what we see in the national stage related to immigration, foreigners, or refugees. And these also are largely based on fear of the unknown and what might happen when new species come. And there's nothing wrong per se. Tim Campbell and I have recently done a study with one of our colleagues to see whether these nativist or militaristic metaphors perform relative to a more science-based approach. And our results, I'd be happy to share that, found that science actually performs just as well as some of these more exaggerated forms of communication. Next slide, please. So what are some of the issues of framing aquatic invasive species? You can see to the right here, there's a sign, and that's just reminding transient anglers, and this is more in a prevention context, that it's the law, just reminding people that this isn't just a voluntary request. It might not be enforced that often, but it's the law. And like I said before, there has been some research on message framing that we've seen in a preventive context, but not in a lakeshore property manager notion of how they make decisions about what strategies to use. There has been some research that shows that, like I said, that sensationalized framing is not more effective than science-based messaging. And I just want to remind us, because I want to generate some thinking and some discussion around this, but that emotional framing of aquatic invasive species, even if it's engaging in a certain way, may increase fear and anxiety about AIS without a resulting increased awareness knowledge about how to manage AIS once they're present in the lake. Next slide, please. I'll get briefly into the weeds. I won't go over this really careful, but one, I'd like to send a shout out to Eric Olson and his team in Stevens Point. We were able to create our sampling frame from a data set, the statewide parcel initiative. We eliminated certain people like limited liability corporations or entities, other business entities, properties owned by counties. So basically, we're just focusing on lakeshore property owners. And moreover, we wanted to make sure we had representation from different types of lakeshore property owners. And what we specifically sampled were people that live on lakes that are currently uncolonized with aquatic plants, lakes that have been recently colonized with aquatic plants from 2015 or more recently, and then ones that have been established with aquatic plants before 2015. So we're looking at not at all recent and people that have had AIS for a longer time. I was really excited, I think we all were, that we had 747 surveys returned out of 1,200, which is a 63% response rate, which is one of the better response rates I've seen in my career working in this space. And the survey, just for those of you who are interested, we followed what's called a modified Doman method, where we initially mailed out the questionnaire and explained what it was for. If people didn't respond, we sent a reminder letter with a crisp $1 bill in the envelope. And then there was a final reminder sent to those who had not completed the survey. And the administration of the survey was conducted by the University of Wisconsin Survey Center, which really did an excellent job on this. Next one, Richard. So just to give you a broad sense of the methods that Richard will be going over in just a moment, and just to let you know, Richard is a PhD student, and he's been the graduate assistant funded by the Department of Natural Resources to help with the analysis and reporting of the work that we've done here. So some of the issues that we're looking at is familiarity with aquatic invasive species, both from a prevention as well as a management standpoint. Opinion about how aquatic invasive species impact Wisconsin lakes. We want to know where people get information about AIS. We were also curious about how AIS impact various qualities of the lake, for instance, scenic beauty, quality for swimming, fishing, or boating, but basically how do lakeshore property owners feel like AIS affect their lakes. We were also really interested in their familiarity with management approaches. So how much do people know about biological approaches, chemical approaches, monitoring, manual approaches? Related to these, we also want to know how risky did people see each of these different management strategies being towards their lake. And related to who people listen from, we also want to know who they trust related to information about aquatic invasive species. Emotions, we talked about that a little bit earlier in terms of fear appeals, but emotions can very much affect the types of decisions people make. And if people are afraid, they're more likely to make more drastic decisions versus slowing down. And then, of course, we also wanted to look at demographics. So Richard, if you want to take it from here and go over the results, we'll circle back to me after you do so. Oh, actually, this is mine also. My apologies. So just to give you a sense for how we define this, we really needed to make this pretty simple and accessible for the survey audience in order to reduce respondent burden. So I'm not going to read all of these. Jeannie will share the presentations afterwards. And we also have a report that we'd be happy to share. In fact, Richard, maybe I'll put something in the box while you're speaking if people want to access more information. But you can see we went through various definitions, like what is a biological approach? Using a known pest of a plant, such as an insect, the chemical approach, applying chemicals, also known as an herbicide, but you all can read that. But we're basically looking at the different approaches that we were aware of, and we worked closely with getting reviews by the DNR, Eric Olson's shop, Extension. So we think we had a pretty thorough range of management options. All right, Richard, take it from here. Thank you.
Okay, so some of the key findings that I thought were interesting, well, where did that go? Some sources of AIS information. So we wanted to know where people get their information about aquatic invasive species from. And unfortunately, the majority of people never get their information about invasive species from some staff and scientists. Local government officials also less so. That's kind of predictable. So some more of the informal channels, like other lakefront property owners, leaders of lake groups, associations, or districts, those tend to be the go-to sources of information. And it wasn't included in this analysis, but about half of our sample reported that they had, it was about 51%, reported that they had never attended a lake association meeting in the last 2 years, but the rest of the sample did. So there's some varying levels of activity, and also there's some variance in terms of where people get their sources of information about aquatic invasive species. Oh. In terms of how familiar people are with AIS, people reported that they were very familiar. Over half said they have heard a lot about AIS. So most people reported hearing something. However, we'll see here in a second, despite hearing a lot about AIS, people were less familiar with ways to manage them once they were found in their lakes. So when looking at how familiar they were with ways to prevent the spread of AIS, very few people said that they were not at all familiar. But ways to manage them once present, about 25% said that they were not at all familiar with ways to manage AIS once they've been found in their lakes. So we kind of have a bit of an opposite trend here, which I thought was really interesting, not having a background in invasive species and being new to this this type of research. I thought this pattern was particularly interesting, that there would be such a large discrepancy there. And we also asked them about how familiar they were with varying different approaches to managing aquatic invasive species. And so basically the question was, how familiar are you with the manual, mechanical, chemical, etc. approach? The highest levels of familiarity were for the things like the manual, mechanical, and chemical. These might be things that people see excuse me, being done more often. The chemical approach might be more familiar to some people, because their lake association, for example, pays to have the lake chemically treated. The mechanical harvesters tend to be fairly obvious, and people are relatively familiar with pulling plants by hand. The lowest levels of familiarity, 71% said they were not at all familiar with the physical or the regulatory approaches, so the overwhelming majority. And also the biological had very low levels of familiarity. In terms of what approaches are actually used on their lake, people didn't really seem to know very much. Folks reported more frequently that the manual approach has been used on their lake. But a considerable portion across all categories, that's the don't know here on the right-hand side, reported that they don't know, whether it was a mechanical, chemical, biological, whatever. A good chunk of people reported not knowing, which I also thought was really interesting. So we also asked people their perception of how aquatic invasive species will impact lakes in Wisconsin, both overall and currently. And unsurprisingly, the overwhelming majority of people had a negative view of the impact of AIS in their lakes. So a good chunk of folks said that they very, very negatively impact Wisconsin lakes, both currently and in the future. Very few people said positive or somewhat positive, which is not so surprising, but the degree of negativity and how they view the impact of AIS, I think, is important. We also did a couple of ANOVAs to compare means across whether or not the sample had AIS, they perceived that their lake had AIS, or they perceived that their lake did not have AIS, or whether they said that they didn't know. So those who perceived that their lake had AIS, and those who report that they don't know, were more likely to report a negative impact of AIS on the quality of the lake for fishing. That was one of the recreational qualities that we asked people. There was no significant differences for the others, like boating, swimming, or the impacts on the human health, for example. I thought that was also pretty interesting. Fishing, I guess, is a very popular recreational activity. Also related to impact, this is just kind of to show the sample breakdown. 52% of people said that yes, their lake had AIS. 32% said don't know, and 16% said no. Because we did not cross-check, we have some natural resources data from Eric Olson that lists various invasive species in each particular water body. We didn't verify whether or not that they were correct. That's potentially an upcoming paper. So this is a measure of perceived knowledge of AIS, because we don't know if it's, they're correct about it. However, it's important to note that when it comes to an individual's behavior, there's little to no difference between perceived and actual knowledge in terms of how it impacts the way people react to various things. As Bret mentioned, one of the important variables was the perception of risks and benefits to the different management approaches. And so that was measured on a 7-point Likert scale, going from the risks greatly outweighed the benefits to the benefits greatly outweigh the risks. The riskiest approach was perceived to be the chemical. About a fifth perceived the risks to greatly outweigh the benefits. And the biological approach was also viewed similarly. The least risky approaches were the manual, and the monitoring or mechanical were also considered to be minimally risky. And we'll see that here in a second. This is just a graph of what that looks like. 48% said the benefits greatly outweighed the risks for the manual. Also pretty big chunks for the mechanical and the monitoring approach. And of course, the most risky was the chemical. Regulatory, I'm not really sure why people, had that kind of perception of regulatory, but 23% said the benefits somewhat outweigh the risks. So I guess it kind of balances out, but the chemical is a big standout there in terms of the risk perception. So we also wanted to know whether or not a person's perception of having AIS in their lake influenced their risk and benefit perception of the chemical approach. And it did, that those who perceived that their lake had AIS were significantly more likely to perceive greater risk benefits versus risks of the chemical approach, versus compared to those who did not perceive AIS and those who said they didn't know. In terms of perceived knowledge, these were some of the variables that we asked people, whether or not they agree or disagreed with various statements related to management and AIS. And so, for example, one question was, a chemical herbicide is worth using even if it harms native plants. So while a lot of people disagree, they don't believe it's worth using even if it harms native plants. There's still a fairly considerable chunk of respondents who do agree with that, either somewhat or strongly, but also, between about a fifth or a quarter, whether or not they have AIS, they don't know, or they say they don't, is neither agree nor disagree. So that's kind of a persuadable middle, which is quite a lot of people that could be persuaded either that, yeah, it's worth using chemicals that harm native plants, or no, it doesn't. So I think that middle section is the portion of respondents to pay attention to. In terms of emotions, folks didn't really feel, luckily, very many negative emotions. But the one that stood out the most was curious. We had 34% of people said that they were very curious, 13% extremely curious about, managing AIS on a lake. And in terms of moving forward and partnering with homeowners, that would be something that we can keep an eye towards, is capitalizing on homeowner curiosity about AIS management. Luckily, I think for us, 45% reported that they were not at all angry. But interestingly, when, frustration was a significant predictor in preferences for chemical treatment, and that's in an upcoming paper. Negative affect played a role in terms of people's preferences for chemical treatment. So people feel very negatively about AIS, they want them gone, and potentially chemicals seem to be the way to do that. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Bret so he can talk a little bit about some of the recommendations and also some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Richard. So one of the things that we recommend is a lot of times in our field, we don't just encourage people to get out more information, because information is usually necessary but not sufficient for behavior or attitude change. That said, there's a clear gap between people's awareness or knowledge about how to prevent invasive species and how to manage invasive species. And as a group, you all may need to consider dialing up communications about how to manage aquatic invasive species. As the emotions slide just showed that Richard went over, that surprisingly curiosity was one of the strongest emotions that people shared towards aquatic invasive species. So this is something that could be capitalized on to educate about management, while also minimizing emotionally charged language, which might contribute to more preference for more aggressive strategies. Also, there's a whole literature around social norms. And in fact, we're actually preparing some outreach materials that we'll end up sharing with you all. But Sharing the risk-benefit opinions of other lakeshore property owners could help establish social norms amongst community members about management approaches, because for most of these management decisions, they're going to be conducted at a lake level, at a community versus a personal decision. So a person can make a little bit of impact around their space, but to really deal with something at a larger scale, you need the cooperation of your neighbors. It's also interesting that the perceived presence of aquatic invasive species can change risk-benefit calculations of property owners. So we want to help people understand better about what are some of the risks and benefits before new populations are established, to help them make choices that are consistent with their values. I've talked with a lot of people in this space, and I haven't heard anyone tell me that chemicals do not have a role to play for some situations, but what they were concerned about is people going there as their first thing. Using a medical metaphor, if I have a certain form of cancer or something like that, and maybe that's too strong of a metaphor, but I've talked to surgeons before where they're like, this is an emotional emergency because that cancer has been in you for a while, not a biological emergency. And so how do we get people to like slow down, keep chemical as a potential option, but maybe not start there? And also based on our data, and we've seen this in previous studies as well, has continued to position lake organizations and leaders as a source of trusted information on these issues. And so if you could go on, Richard. So one of the recommendations that we make is to communicate to lakeshore property owners whether the lake has aquatic invasive species or not, and what approaches have been used on their lake. However, one of the interesting things to note is based on the way AIS is currently being communicated about now, those who believe they have an aquatic invasive species on their lake are also more likely to prefer a more aggressive management strategy. So it's not just about informing them, but changing the information that they're getting if we're trying to get people to make a slower, more deliberate set of decisions around managing AIS on their lake. And also they also want to understand is, you can use chemicals, for example, but what are some of the potential trade-offs or risks that those approaches might have to their lake? We're also thinking that a partnership should encourage cooperation, both with other lakeshore property owners and also local officials, folks like yourselves, to reduce feelings of fear and anxiety about AIS and giving people a sense of empowerment about how they can deal with it if they get one on their lake. Something else that monitoring by some might be considered a passive exercise, like it's not really doing something, but we suggest treating monitoring as an active management strategy, because you are watching to see what happens. Does it increase, decrease? Does it stay the same? And if lakeshore property owners can become engaged in the management process by taking a more active role in monitoring, they may be more open to understanding all the strategies that are available to them. Next slide, Richard. So what are some of the next steps for this? We're almost done here. One is we're developing what we're initially calling a rapid response kit for homeowners with new AIS. This is going to include a fact sheet, which I'll show you the front part of in just a second. We're creating these outreach materials, and then also are going to pilot test it with property owners to make sure that they're received in the way that they are intended. We're also developing some social media ads that we will be sharing with our funding from this grant that people can use to post that would target homeowners, whether it was proactive, as Amy was saying earlier, or reactive when a lake gets a new AIS. We've also had different studies that have shown, and it's very just clear having used the tool, that social media sites like Facebook or Instagram, Snapchat or others, Facebook's the giant one here, provide powerful tools to target specific subsections of the population with specific messaging. So for instance, if you have a specific region or lake, you could literally drop a pin, a geographic pin, and say, I want to communicate this message within a 2-mile radius, so that everyone logging onto Facebook could get some information about how to manage AIS if it's coming their way. Something else that I've been talking with Tim Campbell about, but we haven't executed on yet, is that Google Ads can be used to promote content that encourages more deliberate planning to counter competitive messaging and address AIS for active information seekers. So when you're on Facebook, typically you're not looking for information on aquatic invasive species prevention or management. However, if you go to Google as a search engine and type in something like, how do I control Eurasian water milfoil? You may not be surprised to know that different chemical companies have already bought those terms and their ads appear right up top. So one of the things we want to experiment, and again, we're not suggesting that chemicals don't play a potential role in management, but we might want to let people know that there's other strategies that you could try first. And that's using Google Ads, you can reach active information seekers in strategic ways. So I just want you all to be thinking about passive information seekers as well as active information seekers. Thanks, Richard. You could go on. So some of the questions that I just wanted to ask, and we're not going to have much time, if any time at all, but just things for you all to think about, is what type of communications are currently targeted at lakeshore property owners, and how might those messages be adjusted based on results from our study? My impression, having worked in this space for a while, and I'm not making a binary statement, but is there potentially a one-size-fits-all mentality for boaters and anglers, whereas lakeshore property owners might be a distinctive audience? So I don't have the answer there, but it's something I'm curious about. Another thing that I've been wondering about that I think you all should think about is, when is the best timing to educate lakeshore property owners? Amy was talking earlier about being more proactive than reactive. And I don't think it's an either or binary thing. So you all could start educating people about different management strategies if their lake is at risk, but you could also, when a new population is introduced, treat it as a rapid response kit. So I would definitely agree about being proactive, but that doesn't mean you can't be reactive appropriately as well. By what channels should we communicate guidance to homeowners about what to do if their lake gets an AIS? You know, lake associations, email, social media. And then finally, I was thinking that what message sources or influencers should we be communicating with to communicate a more deliberate decision-making process about AIS management strategies? Is that it, Richard? Yeah, there you go. That's our data. And those are some of our recommendations. So Jeannie, I don't know if we're out of time or if we can accept a couple questions.
No, we have almost 10 minutes. So why don't you put the slide with the questions back up, so we have that as a reference. There you go. Does anyone want to kick off some thoughts? Maybe we've been saying a lot about Foxwolf Watershed Alliances, humongous project they're working on right now. Chris Acey, is there some thoughts you've got maybe related to that in this? I should check to make sure he was still on.
I'm still here, Jeannie. I mean, it's a big question of how to adjust communications, right? In terms of addressing property owners themselves, we've done a couple things in the past, I know. I haven't led those projects of talking to property owners, but we've done something similar where we've reached out with a couple surveys, but that's about it from what Foxwolf has done.
One of the things that I wanted to ask is, I was surprised in the process of developing these outreach materials based on our survey, when I was looking around for a logical place to put this information. You know, I obviously thought of the DNR, I thought of Extension, I thought of the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership, you know, Wisconsin Lakes, but I wasn't quite sure. I've talked with Eric Olson about potentially posting some of this information on their website, but I was wondering what people think if we were to create materials to target lakeshore property owners, is where is the most sensible home to put this information? And I heard that there was potentially some partnership going on between AIS coordinators in order to share resources like this, but I was wondering if anyone could weigh in about where would be the most sensible place to put this kind of information.
We can always keep things in the box for easy access, but do you mean something like that or more that?
No, what I mean is, like, let's say
Right.
someone gets a new, like, you want to educate a lake or a lake set of lakes in a different region, and you want to use Google ads, or you want to use Facebook ads or organic posting, and you're directing them to a property on the web. Which web property would we send them to?
This is Mike Engelson from Wisconsin Lakes. One thing I've been wondering, because we've seen in the way that in the reaction to the aquatic plant management rule revision and some other non-AIS related things, that there are a lot of campaigns on the behalf of industry or other companies where they're setting up their own websites, and so it's sort of disguising where the information is coming from. And I've wondered, like, to answer your question, I've wondered, would a dedicated website that really, where it's clear, it's less clear who's providing the information and more clear that the information is about AIS education and tools and management, things like that. If it makes more sense to have it separated, or if it is like housed at a certain place. So if someone comes to a standalone website, do they not have to get over the hurdle of, oh, okay, this is a university entity that's doing it, or this is a self-interested nonprofit or something like that? Interested what you think.
Richard, do you want to comment on that?
I'm not sure that I have any input that's worth hearing, to be honest with you.
Well, that's fine. I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking through too. I don't know that I have the answers, but I think it's an important discussion to be had, because if I or other extension specialists, or any of you really, are going to direct people towards a centralized place, there are competing messages out there. And how do we make this as easy as possible for people to access? How do we reduce the amount of sort of red tape while still maintaining quality control? And I don't know the answers, but I would encourage you all to have an active discussion about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like from the study that maybe the more important thing from our standpoint is that we reach the sort of influencers out amongst the organizations that then provide that information to everyone else on the lake. So maybe it's, we're making sure that the leaders on those organizations have the information that they need and can point people towards a resource. Maybe it's less that the individual like property owner is going to be looking stuff up themselves. I don't know.
We have
Thank you.
comments came in. Tim mentioned maybe it would work on something like the Healthy Lakes website. Zach Wilson mentioned it's hard to keep up with the Lake Association's communication. There's a lot of turnover annually on association presidents. I think we need to encourage them to update contacts on the state DNR websites. Also encourage them to join Wisconsin Lakes and maintain communication with the local county AIS coordinators. So it kind of was a circle there of coordinators reaching out to them, getting them to keep up with us. And then Eric asked, does LMPN need a web presence? And actually that's something I've been talking to Chad about. I can't remember if I've talked much to Carol about it yet. I would love to have some kind of LMPN webpage that people could go to for resources. it's harder to manage it probably through DNR than it would be through extension, but even there's some questions that we haven't quite overcome. So other ideas welcome. Anybody else? We still have a minute to go.
I was just going to chime in that I like, I think Michael's idea of having a third party website, because I think sometimes the DNR, between the DNR and UW extension and other things get published multiple times in different spots, then links break and that type of thing happens, which is okay. But having a third party where it's just like, this is exactly where it lives and it changes here maybe once in a blue moon, but keeping it very concise, I think would be really helpful, because sometimes I know like DNR resources and that type of thing, sometimes it's a little bit clunky to try and figure out which one's the most up to date, if that makes sense.
All right, well, what's new, I had put a link in if people want to look at the full report that we generated for the DNR. I think it was meant to be shared more broadly. And if anybody wants to reach out to Richard or I, you could easily find our information online. In fact, like I think our emails are on the report, but we appreciate your time and attention. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.